I was kneeling in the soil with a trowel in one hand and a broken sunflower stalk in the other when the granola bar hit me in the neck. At first I thought it was just a leaf or a small branch until I looked down and saw the half-eaten, chocolate-drizzled insult lying among the crushed petals. The sound of a revving SUV engine growled behind me, and before I could look up, Karen's voice screeched out like nails on a chalkboard. I didn't even need to turn around to know who it was. She was already speeding off, her luxury tires grinding into the soft dirt where my marigolds used to bloom. My eyes narrowed. My hand trembled. That was the last straw. You don't mess with a man's flowers, especially not when that man designs military-grade traps for fun. A week ago, everything had been serene. My little corner of the neighborhood had become my personal sanctuary. Ever since retiring early from an engineering job that most people would call top secret and my wife insisted I call extremely boring, I had found peace in gardening. I didn't need much. Just sunflowers on the east edge, tulips lining the walk, and marigolds dancing along the driveway. Birds chirped, bees buzzed, and for a while it felt like I was finally living in harmony with the universe. Then Karen happened. Karen, whose actual name was Denise but who had self-labeled herself as the HOA Garden Compliance Officer. That wasn't a real title, of course. She just printed it on her own letterhead and stuck it under windshield wipers. She didn't knock. She barked. She didn't suggest. She threatened. And she had taken a special interest in my driveway flower bed the moment she noticed the blooms extended 2 inches over the HOA regulation sidewalk line, a rule she had likely invented on the spot. At first it was just warnings. Notes tucked into my mailbox with words like hazard and unsanctioned growth. I smiled and waved whenever I saw her, assuming that kindness would soften her. It did not. Instead, she escalated. She started driving closer to my flowers each morning on her way to wherever HOA tyrants go. And when I say closer, I mean with inches to spare. I caught her tire rolling over a few petals once. I chalked it up to an accident. Then it happened again. And again. Until one morning I found deep tire tracks over the entire edge of my garden. 10 sunflowers snapped at the base like dry spaghetti. I stood there for a full minute, speechless, heart pounding. I had served in 2 overseas deployments and never felt the kind of anger I did staring at those ruined plants. That's when I tried to talk to her. Like a reasonable person. I walked up to her the next day, caught her just as she was returning from the gym in her neon pink leggings and massive sunglasses. I explained that the flowers were within legal boundaries and asked her politely not to drive over them. She laughed in my face and said, and I quote, maybe plant something more durable, like plastic. Then she swerved onto the edge of my garden again as she drove away. I brought it up to the HOA. I had pictures, timestamps, even a small video clip from my front-facing security camera. But Karen had already filed a complaint about me. She said I was planting unauthorized shrubbery that obstructed the sidewalk and caused visual clutter. Visual clutter. As if marigolds were graffiti. The board took her side. They said they'd look into it, which was HOA speak for we're afraid of her and we don't want to deal with this. That night I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea and stared at the damage. The sun had dipped low and the orange glow hit the crushed petals like a war zone memorial. I remembered the projects I used to work on. Trip-resistant border sensors. Remote-controlled perimeter defense for outposts. I still had the blueprints in my garage. A slow smile formed. I leaned forward and took a deep breath. If she wanted to treat my flowers like a battlefield, maybe it was time I responded accordingly. Over the next 2 days, I got to work. I drove into town, hit up 3 different hardware stores, and paid in cash. I didn't need anything dangerous. Just something precise. Something that would make a point. I assembled a set of retractable metal spikes designed to activate only under specific pressure. Pedestrian safe. Vehicle hostile. The base of each was encased in rubber and camouflaged beneath a false layer of mulch. When I was finished, they looked exactly like the old flower bed. Except now they had a little attitude. I didn't tell anyone what I had done. I simply replanted what I could and set up a new camera angle that captured the edge of the driveway perfectly. I didn't sleep that night. I waited. Just past 7 a.m., I heard it. The crunch. Not of flowers, but of a front tire meeting unexpected resistance. The sudden clunk was followed by the hiss of air being forcibly expelled. I walked to the edge of my porch with my coffee in hand, pretending to water a hanging plant. Karen was outside her vehicle, arms flailing like she'd just spotted a UFO. She screamed something about sabotage and called the HOA hotline. I offered her a phone. She yelled at me. I suggested she drive more carefully next time. She didn't like that either. By noon, 2 HOA board members had arrived. I showed them the footage. Slow motion, high resolution, time-stamped footage of Karen deliberately swerving over the flower bed while sipping her oat milk latte. They asked me why I had such a sophisticated camera setup. I told them I used to design surveillance systems. They didn't press. Karen was livid. She claimed I had set a trap. I reminded her she had no proof. I also reminded her that if she wanted to inspect my garden, she'd need a warrant. One of the board members, a guy named Bruce who always looked like he was one more complaint away from quitting, just nodded slowly and said maybe we should all give each other a little more space. Karen stormed off, limping slightly because her heel had snapped while getting out of her car. I watched her go, a satisfied warmth blooming in my chest. But this wasn't over. Not even close. Because what Karen didn't know was that her little flower-crushing hobby had been the first crack in a much bigger wall. And when I started digging around the HOA records to prepare for a formal complaint, I found something I wasn't supposed to find. Something about community funds, landscaping budget, and a recurring invoice paid to a company that didn't exist. I smiled again. This time, not just because my garden was safe, but because I had just discovered the perfect fertilizer for revenge. And the real show was about to begin. The next morning came with a quiet thrill. I sat on the porch with a fresh cup of tea, eyes fixed on the edge of the flower bed like a fisherman waiting for a tug on the line. I had reset the spike system just before sunrise, ensuring the pressure plates were calibrated and hidden perfectly beneath a fresh layer of mulch and flowers. Nothing deadly. Nothing illegal. But enough to make a point. I didn't want revenge for the sake of cruelty. I just wanted respect for the small square of earth I called mine. Karen's SUV didn't disappoint. Right on schedule, she came barreling down the street in her shiny black monstrosity, music blaring through tinted windows. I watched her wheel twitch slightly toward the curb, the same subtle jerk she made every time she casually mowed down the edge of my plant. Her tires met the soil with a satisfying thud, followed by a sharp hiss. She slammed the brakes and swerved, stopping the vehicle halfway into the neighbor's lawn. A beat of silence passed. Then came the wail. She jumped out, still wearing that ridiculous silk robe like she was royalty on a patio break. She pointed at the ground and shouted words I hadn't heard since basic training. My neighbor, Linda, peeked through her blinds. Across the street, the Martins froze mid-dog walk. Even the mailman slowed down. I remained seated, swirling the tea with my spoon as Karen screamed something about sabotage, terrorism, and illegal booby trap. I offered to call a tow truck. She screamed louder. When I walked down my driveway to see the damage, I noticed that only one of her front tires had actually been punctured. Barely at that. The spikes had done just enough. Any more would have been overkill. I reminded her calmly that the edge of the garden was still my property and suggested she reconsider her driving technique in the future. That only sent her further into orbit. Within an hour, a few HOA board members arrived. Apparently, Karen had called an emergency meeting and brought them straight to the scene. Bruce, the reluctant board president with permanent eye bags and a polo shirt that hadn't fit properly in 10 years, approached me with his usual heavy sigh. He asked me if I had installed anything dangerous on my lawn. I said no. I explained that I had simply reinforced the flower bed with motion-triggered vibration sensors to protect from vermin and pests. I handed him a laminated diagram. He stared at it, confused, before handing it back like it was printed in Sanskrit. Karen interrupted, demanding that I be fined, investigated, and arrested. She accused me of harboring malicious intent, then dramatically pulled out a clipboard with printed HOA regulations. I looked over her shoulder and saw the highlighted section. No fixtures or installations without HOA architectural approval. I smiled and said, actually, I had never installed a fixture. Just upgraded a garden bed. She fumed and shoved the clipboard back into her SUV. At that point, Bruce seemed ready to walk into traffic. I told him I had footage of her trespassing and causing deliberate property damage. He asked to see it, and I pulled out a tablet. Karen tried to grab it, but I pulled it back just in time. I showed them the high-definition recording of her SUV swerving toward the garden multiple times over the past month, crushing everything without hesitation. There were timestamps, location data, and even one clip of her talking on speakerphone about how flowers don't belong on driveways anyway. The look on Bruce's face was priceless. He tried to form a sentence, but no words came out. The other board member, a quiet woman named Maureen, who always looked like she'd rather be baking cookies than attending HOA functions, just muttered that maybe this needed to be reviewed more formally. Karen, however, doubled down. She claimed I had fabricated the footage and demanded a forensic review. She called it deepfake technology. I nearly laughed. It would have been funny if it wasn't so absurd. Later that afternoon, I checked the flower bed again and found that nothing had been touched. No tire tracks, no damage, just healthy soil and flowers that looked as though they were finally allowed to breathe. I had won the first round. But this wasn't over, because later that evening, I found a printed citation on my front door from the HOA. It stated I was in violation of safety standards due to unauthorized defensive modifications. The wording was vague and dramatic, like something copied from a spy movie script. I knew Karen had written it. Rather than get angry, I got curious. That night, I opened my laptop and started reviewing the HOA's recent expenditures. As a property owner, I had access to budget reports, and as someone who had worked for years in military intelligence, I was trained to notice inconsistencies. It didn't take long. I found multiple landscaping invoices paid to a company called Bloom and Trim LLC. Each payment was in the range of $5,000 to $10,000. But when I looked up the company, there was no physical address, no phone number, no website, just a P.O. box that linked back to Karen's cousin's name in a different state. It clicked. The reason Karen was so desperate to remove my flowers wasn't just about her ego. It was about power and control over the neighborhood's aesthetic contract. If she could force me to get rid of my garden, she could justify using HOA funds to re-landscape it through her preferred vendor. I realized then that her vendetta wasn't personal, it was profitable. And if this company was fake, then it meant Karen might be skimming HOA funds under everyone's noses. I copied the files, saved them to a secure drive, and wrote a long email to a contact I had from my old job who now worked as a freelance fraud investigator. Then I forwarded a condensed version to Linda, who I knew had experience in local tax auditing. She texted back within 5 minutes. One word. Bingo. But I knew I had to be careful. If Karen smelled an investigation coming, she'd either destroy the evidence or double down on framing me. I had to keep her distracted. So I did the one thing I knew would push her buttons. I replanted even more flowers. By the end of the next day, my flower bed had doubled in size. I added decorative arches with morning glories. I installed tiny LED path lights. I even set out a ceramic frog statue holding a sign that read, "This lawn is protected by nature and nerd." Karen saw it all from her window. Her face twisted like she had bitten into a lemon. I could almost see the gears turning. She wasn't going to let this go. And that was exactly what I wanted. Because the deeper she dug, the closer she would get to exposing herself. And I would be right there, watering my garden, collecting her mistakes, one spike at a time. The next 3 days were quieter than I expected, but not in a good way. Karen's SUV didn't roll over the flower bed again, which should have been a relief, but her absence from her usual morning routine only meant she was busy plotting something behind the scenes. The stillness felt wrong, like the eye of a storm. I spent that time reinforcing the garden bed, not just with spikes, but with pressure sensors and hidden trail cams designed to alert my phone if anyone stepped near. It wasn't just about the flowers anymore. It was about staying 3 moves ahead of someone who had no limits and no shame. Linda came by with a folder in her hand and a storm in her eyes. She didn't even knock. Just opened the gate, marched up the porch steps, and dropped the papers on my table. She had been doing some deep diving on Bloom and Trim LLC and uncovered more invoices, over $20,000 billed to our HOA in the past 6 months alone. All for vague line items like seasonal renewal and soil detoxification. There were no before and after pictures, no receipts for plants or labor. And then she found a grant signed off by Karen herself that authorized an emergency fund transfer for a beautification project that never happened. I looked at the dates and smiled grimly. That so-called project had supposedly taken place during the same week Karen was out of town for a spa retreat. We didn't need a courtroom to know what this was. It was fraud. And it wasn't just unethical. It was criminal. But the key now was timing. We had to catch her with her guard down, preferably while she was still on the offensive, still thinking she had the upper hand. So I encouraged Linda to keep gathering quietly while I prepared my next move. And as it turned out, I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, a letter arrived from the HOA. Not in the mailbox, taped to my front door like some kind of medieval warning. It wasn't just a citation this time. It was a demand. I had 72 hours to remove the garden bed or face daily fines of $100, increasing to $500 after the first week. The notice was signed by the acting board president, which, surprise surprise, was now Karen. Apparently Bruce had resigned suddenly, citing stress and burnout. I imagined he finally decided his blood pressure wasn't worth battling over geraniums and gossip. Karen's signature on that letter looked smug even in ink. I folded it neatly and placed it on the same pile where I kept all my HOA nonsense. Then I got to work. I printed photos of the garden from before the damage. Beautiful, compliant, neatly spaced, well within the property line. I included time-stamped footage of her car swerving into my flower bed, multiple angles, all clear. I attached Linda's financial records and cross-referenced HOA funds paid to Bloom and Trim. I packaged it all into a clean little file titled HOA Misconduct Master File and made 5 secure copies. One went to Linda. One to a lawyer I used to work with on classified patent dispute. One was mailed to a local news channel. One stayed in my house. And the last one, the most important, was uploaded to a private cloud folder with a timed release protocol. If anything happened to me or my property, that file would hit public inboxes and forums automatically. Karen, oblivious to the minefield she was about to walk into, made her next move later that afternoon. I caught her outside with 2 other board members, both of whom looked vaguely familiar but had never bothered to introduce themselves in all the years I'd lived here. They had clipboards, measuring tape, and the kind of smug attitude you only get when you think rules are weapons. I watched them from my porch. Karen strutted across my lawn like she owned it, pointing out random spots in the flower bed and calling them encroachments. One of the men bent down to examine the mulch. He got too close to one of the hidden trail cams, and my phone buzzed immediately. I sipped my tea. Karen turned to me and shouted that the inspection was official and binding, that I had 24 hours now to remove the entire installation or face not just fines, but legal action. I raised an eyebrow and asked her to show me the charter clause that allowed HOA officers to conduct inspections without owner consent. She waved a packet in the air and said it was all in there. I said I'd take it under review, and reminded her to stay off the flowers if she didn't want another tire problem. That made her stumble slightly, but she recovered fast and barked something about calling her lawyer. Later that evening, Linda called me. Apparently Karen had submitted a motion to fast-track foreclosure processes on homes that repeatedly violated landscaping standard. It was absurd on its face, completely unenforceable, but it showed just how desperate she was to get me out of the picture. She didn't just want to win. She wanted to erase any challenge to her control. And that's when I knew I couldn't just beat her. I had to dismantle her kingdom, brick by brick, in front of the entire neighborhood. So I set my final trap. That night, I replaced the spike system with a decoy. The pressure sensors were still active, but instead of spikes, I installed a die-pack trigger, a harmless but very colorful surprise meant to spray whoever tampered with the mulch again. Non-toxic, temporary, and very visible. Then I adjusted the cameras for maximum coverage and waited. Just after midnight, the alert came in. Someone was at the edge of the flower bed. The footage showed a hooded figure crouched low, fiddling with the soil. I zoomed in. It was Karen. She was wearing gloves, trying to dig something up. I had no doubt she thought she'd find a booby trap or buried nails, something she could report or use to sue me. But all she got was a blast of blue and green dye that covered her gloves, her face, and her white hoodie in streaks like a toddler's painting project. She screamed and bolted, tripping over her own feet and landing flat on her back. I watched the footage twice. Then I saved it, labeled it Karen 12 a.m. dye disaster, and emailed it to Linda. The next morning, Karen didn't come outside. But her SUV was already at the mechanic again, probably replacing another tire. More importantly, Linda reported that the HOA group chat had exploded with members questioning the citations, the rushed elections, and the fund allocations. Screenshots of my flowerbed footage and the dye-stained Karen were circulating. The tide was turning. And I hadn't even released the financial report yet. That was coming soon. But first, I had one last thing to do. I bought a new sign and placed it at the edge of my garden, right where her tire tracks used to be. It read "Smile for the bees." And the cameras. The message was clear. And the war was far from over. But now it was on my terms. The following morning, the neighborhood felt different. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something to explode. I took my time with breakfast, watering the garden in my usual robe and slippers, quietly whistling while the morning sun painted my marigolds in gold. I knew the dye trap footage had made its rounds overnight. I hadn't posted it publicly, but someone had shared it from Linda's forwarded clips, and once it started circulating in HOA group chats and private messages, there was no stopping it. Karen's midnight flower raid was the talk of the entire subdivision. I heard whispers before I even stepped off my porch. A couple walking their dogs slowed down as they passed by, both trying to hide their smirks. The teenager who usually rode his scooter down the sidewalk gave me a salute. Even the garbage collectors honked and gave me a thumbs up. But Karen's house stayed dark. No SUV in the driveway. Curtains closed. Probably scrubbing herself clean of the embarrassment while simultaneously trying to figure out how to spin it as sabotage. Linda came by just before noon, clutching a folder full of updates and sipping an iced coffee like she was ready for war. She sat on my porch swing and let out a long sigh before launching into the chaos. Several board members had broken ranks, questioning the legitimacy of Karen's appointment as acting president. Apparently, Bruce's resignation had come under suspicious circumstances. According to his wife, Karen had pressured him into stepping down by threatening to report him for a made-up infraction involving an unpermitted garden gnome. It didn't end there. 3 households had formally requested a financial audit. One member demanded to see all invoices tied to Bloom and Trim LLC. Another neighbor submitted a petition to recall Karen from the board entirely, citing financial misconduct, abuse of authority, and psychological harassment of community members. Linda smiled as she read the list aloud. I could hear the tension unraveling thread by thread. That afternoon, I received an email from a local news channel. Someone had leaked my camera footage, along with a tip about HOA funds being used fraudulently. They wanted a statement. I wasn't ready to go on record yet, but I agreed to send over a detailed document outlining the timeline, accompanied by supporting screenshots, video links, and notarized testimonies from 2 other residents who had also caught Karen misusing her HOA status for personal gain. The news anchor wrote back within minutes, asking for an interview. I said maybe soon. Around 5 o'clock, the trap finally sprang wide open. An emergency HOA meeting was called. Karen didn't even show. Instead, she sent a typed statement claiming she was the victim of targeted harassment and slander, and that she had video evidence of illegal installations in my yard. The board asked her to submit the footage for review. She didn't. Then she went silent. At the meeting, which Linda attended in person, residents were fired up. People I'd never spoken to were standing up and recounting their own grievances. Wrongful citations, threats of fines, denied improvement requests, even surveillance photos taken by Karen of people's front lawns without consent. Someone revealed that Karen had once told them their daughter's chalk art was a graffiti violation and tried to fine them for it. The room turned quickly, and a vote was held right there. Karen was formally suspended from the board pending investigation. Her access to HOA resources was revoked, and a third-party accounting firm was contracted for a full audit. Linda texted me a photo of the moment the vote passed. It was glorious. People cheering. Some standing. One elderly man had tossed his HOA violation letters into the air like confetti. I couldn't stop smiling. The next day, I finally gave in to the interview request. I met the news anchor in my backyard, surrounded by flowers and toolkits. I walked them through everything from the first crushed sunflower to the motion-activated die pack. I kept my tone calm, measured, even humorous at times. I didn't want to sound bitter. Just rational. Like someone who'd been pushed too far by petty power. When the story aired that evening, they titled it The Garden That Fought Back. It was everywhere by morning. Social media was ablaze. Some viewers even began sharing their own HOA horror stories in the comments. Karen had become a symbol, not of order, but of overreach. And I had become something I never intended, a local folk hero. But even with all the celebration, I stayed alert. I didn't trust silence. Sure enough, Karen made one last desperate move. She filed a lawsuit against me for emotional distress, claiming my traps were designed to humiliate her and caused psychological trauma. Her lawyers sent a demand letter asking for a public apology, removal of the spike system, and a financial settlement. I passed the letter to my attorney, who sent back a simple 2-sentence reply. My client does not negotiate with bullies. All future communication should go through legal channels. To make matters worse for Karen, the HOA audit began releasing findings. One of the first reports confirmed that Bloom and Trim LLC was a shell company created 6 months earlier, using Karen's cousin's address in another state. The landscaping grants were entirely fabricated, the funds deposited into accounts that linked back to her family members. The board froze her access and alerted authorities. A formal investigation began. I didn't have to lift another finger. The final nail came from a place I didn't expect. One of the original board members who had voted with Karen early on reached out to me privately. He admitted that Karen had been intimidating them for years, using fake legal threats, doctored documents, and even gossip campaigns to maintain control. He apologized, genuinely. Said he admired how I handled things. That I'd given people the courage to speak up. That, more than any trap I'd set, was the true win. Later that week, I hosted a small gathering in my yard. Neighbors brought folding chairs and snacks. We called it the first annual Peaceful Pedal Picnic. Kids ran around with pinwheels. Adults complimented my new solar lights. Someone brought cookies shaped like sunflowers. I even caught Linda laughing with the same woman who once refused to make eye contact with her at meetings. The whole neighborhood felt lighter. As twilight fell and the solar lights kicked on, I took a slow lap around my flower beds, now blooming with new colors and little decorative signs. I stopped at one that read "Let Things Grow." It felt right. Behind me, laughter echoed across the yard. I smiled. Karen had tried to crush my flowers to assert control. But in the end, all she did was help this neighborhood bloom in ways it hadn't in years. And the best part was, spring was just getting started. The days that followed were almost surreal. The very neighborhood that once felt like a passive battlefield, with neighbors walking by in silence and eyes darting away from conflict, had transformed into something that almost felt like a community again. The flowers bloomed, not just in my yard but in others too. People who hadn't planted so much as a cactus in years were suddenly comparing fertilizers and asking for seed recommendations. One neighbor even planted a row of daffodils along the sidewalk and joked that they were Karen-proof. Everyone laughed, even though we all knew Karen wasn't quite done yet. People like her rarely just walk away. They either double down or combust. She chose to combust. About a week after the HOA board formally suspended her and the news story about the audit gained traction, Karen tried one final, desperate move to reclaim her shattered status. She called for a private neighborhood forum to discuss her side of the story. She invited selected residents, many of whom ignored the invitation altogether. A few who did attend later told me it was one of the most bizarre things they had ever witnessed. Karen walked and dressed like a corporate whistleblower and passed around packets labeled evidence that included blurry photos of my yard, a grainy printout of her own dye-stained hoodie, and what she claimed were expert opinions suggesting the spikes in my garden could cause vehicular failure. Not injury, mind you, just inconvenience. Her evidence packet even included a printout of a Reddit thread titled, "How to Make Karen Leave You Alone," with no mention of where it came from or how it related to anything. Apparently, halfway through her speech, someone raised their hand and asked why she was spending so much time on my garden instead of answering for the missing HOA money. She snapped, accused them of being part of a smear campaign, and stormed out after screaming that flowers don't make a community, rules do. That quote circulated faster than any HOA memo ever had. By the end of the week, someone had painted it on a wooden sign and planted it upside down in the middle of the community dog park. The audit report finally landed with a thud. It was brutal. Not only had Karen funneled HOA funds into fake landscaping projects, but she'd also approved reimbursements to herself for things like aesthetic consulting, outreach brunches, and even flower relocation services, which, as far as we could tell, was just her pulling plants out of her neighbors' yards without asking. The report recommended criminal investigation. The board unanimously voted to hand it over to local authorities. Karen's face went pale when she was informed. I saw her leaving her house later that day with several packed bags, speaking rapidly on her phone while pacing in circles in her driveway. She wasn't arrested yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. I never wished for her to lose everything. But she had spent so much time tormenting people over imaginary rules, so much energy trying to control others through fear and manipulation, that when it all collapsed, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like balance, like nature reasserting itself after someone tried to pave over it. With Karen out of the picture, the HOA went through a full overhaul. New elections were held. People actually showed up this time, including neighbors who hadn't attended a single meeting in years. Linda was voted in as treasurer, and 2 other residents who had previously kept their heads down stepped up to run. I declined the invitation to run myself. I was done with fights and forms. I just wanted to tend my garden, drink my tea, and know that I wouldn't wake up to tire tracks in my begonias again. One of the first things the new board did was reverse the citations Karen had issued, refund fines, and remove restrictions that never made sense in the first place. The HOA newsletter even started featuring a Yard of the Month segment again, which had been quietly discontinued years ago under Karen's watch. Ironically, my garden won the first one back. I didn't make a speech or post it online, but I did hang the tiny certificate on my garage wall. It meant something, Not just for me but for the principle of it all. A few weeks later, a news follow-up aired showing the broader trend of HOA abuse across the country. They used my story as the intro. The anchor called it poetic justice, and the clip of Karen stepping into the die trap played again, this time with slow-motion sound effects and dramatic music. I should have been embarrassed, but I wasn't. People needed to see that standing up to abuse, no matter how small the scale, mattered. I kept adding to the garden, not just to beautify it, but to remind myself that growth doesn't come from control. It comes from care. I built a little stone path winding through the flower beds and added motion-activated lights that glowed gently at night. Kids started using it as a shortcut on their way home from school. No one walked through the beds anymore. They respected it, not out of fear, but because they finally saw it as something that belonged. Then came the package. One morning I found a small box at my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a miniature road sign, no taller than a coffee mug, with the words "Caution, Flowers Bite" etched in silver. I didn't need to guess who it came from. It was Linda's sense of humor, no doubt. I placed it right near the edge of the garden where the spikes had once been and laughed every time someone stopped to admire it. As spring gave way to early summer, life returned to its gentle rhythm. Karen's house went up for sale, though it sat unsold for weeks. No one wanted to live in the place known as the Den of Citations. Eventually, it sold to a young couple who tore out the surveillance cameras Karen had installed and replaced her hedges with vegetables. I welcomed them with a bouquet and a warning about the raccoons. The final touch came one evening as I sat on my porch, a gentle breeze rustling the wind chimes and the smell of jasmine wafting through the air. Linda joined me, holding a drink in each hand and wearing a grin that hadn't left her face in days. She clinked her glass against mine and said, "I've never seen this neighborhood so alive." I smiled back and nodded. "Neither have I." She looked at the flower beds, now thriving and untouchable, and added, "You know, if Karen hadn't tried so hard to destroy this place, we'd never have fixed it." I laughed. Sometimes you need a weed to appreciate the garden. And with that, we sat there in silence, letting the quiet victory settle in. Not a loud one. Not the kind with confetti or applause. Just the kind that blooms slowly, stubbornly, and beautifully. The kind that no SUV can crush again.